Welcome to those watching online, and happy Mother's Day. And as I told everyone here, I'm saying that mostly for the men out there listening, in case you forgot. Run down to the store immediately. Mother's Day. And I'm thankful for my mom. She went to be with Jesus 12 years ago this past Friday. And I was blessed by her faithfulness and her lifelong love and support and prayers for my life. And I would not be here today if she had not brought me to this church all those years ago. And I'm glad that God chose her to be my mom. Now, I have another picture I want to show you. And I've showed you this one before. But it's me and my 4 remaining sisters. And this was taken in December when we went to Georgia for my brother's funeral. And see, we could laugh and smile because he knew Jesus just like all of us do. So we know that we're going to see each other again. But you know, that's really not the whole story. It's not even close, because we're not all happy, lovey. You see, we're just like some of the other families here. And our family has given lots of energy and tears into putting the fun in dysfunctional. Because all of God's children are messed up. I certainly am. And my contribution to those difficult chapters of our lives include raging insecurity, anxiety, anger, depression, ego-driven codependency, desperate need for approval of others, just to name a few. And that doesn't even include my quest for power, pleasure, prestige, and possessions. And other members of our family contributed to their own stuff. And at times, things were very, very difficult. And to top it off, we added to our pain and suffering of things that we tried to keep hidden, to keep an image of a well-respected family. And because of all this, at times it feels like, maybe I'm the least likely candidate to be standing up here right now. But since I know the backstory of my family, I know that we're not the sum total of our worst moments because of grace, the unearned, unmerited, undeserved, unconditional love of God. No failure has to be final, and no pain has to go to waste. God doesn't cause all things, but God can use all things to His glory. And God's power, the same power that raised Jesus from the grave, can be applied in every one of our deepest pains and our most scathing shame or our greatest disappointments. So hear the good news. Even our disgrace can be transformed by God's grace. And if you don't believe me, come up and talk to me after service and I can tell you more about it. So for the moms that are here today who struggle with mistakes and guilt and perfectionism and a whole host of other concerns, I urge you to rest today in the arms of Jesus. Know that you are loved. Know God delights over you. Know God loves your kids no matter what. And receive the gift of freedom found in forgiveness and the power to live on God's approval alone. Also know that your story is not over yet. You may feel like the least likely candidate for God to use, but I invite you to trust God because He can do more than we could ever ask or imagine. And also, for all the kids of any age who are in pain because maybe your mom wounded you deeply. Maybe things weren't always good at home. Know that you have a perfect heavenly parent who can hear your pain and bear your pain and, yes, even heal your pain. God can give beauty for ashes and turn your mourning into dancing again. God can bring wholeness and purpose to your life, even though you too may feel like the least likely candidate for God to use. And even though I don't know the specifics of your story and whatever dysfunction or is part of your story, I am fully convinced of what I'm saying only because I've seen grace bring healing to countless people. I also am fully convinced because I know the stories of the Bible. And one of the things my mom did well was introduce me to the Bible at a young age. And over my lifetime, I've come to understand that the stories in the Bible we find are not only the story of God, but they're our story as well. And we began this series, long story short, tracing God's grace all the way back to in the beginning, when God created the heavens and the earth. And this was chapter 1 of a 6-part series to understand the story of the Bible. And author Joshua McNeil helps us break down the story of the Bible this way. He has creation, fall, Israel, Jesus, church, and new creation. So 2 weeks ago we talked about creation, and that for you and me we're created and complete and on purpose. And we're from and for community. And last week I invited you, as your probably most experienced sinner, to share the story of the fall, because we all recognize the damage that sin causes in our lives, to ourselves, others, and even our world. And even though God our Father shows unrelenting kindness that can lead us to turn back home to a relationship with God. So today we move from the story of one man and one woman to the story of one family or one nation called Israel. And to understand the big picture of the Bible story, we need to understand the story. Their history fills 39 books of the Old Testament. And don't worry, we're not going to do all of them today. When the teaching team met to pray and plan how to approach this message, we considered elaborate charts that could display lots of homework, and maybe we could assign some to you. But since I'm not an English major, I'm not a Bible major, and we think maybe a way to summarize it with the whole story of Israel in 3 ways that would describe each of our life stories. And I think we can simplify the massive story so that we can have a basic understanding of what is going on when we read the Bible in our daily lives, which we encourage you to do. So here's the question we're going to look at for today. How is Israel's story my story? Now, the basic outline for our family story can be found in the Old Testament, my personal story and yours. So come with me as we consider the story of Israel and how it relates to our lives. First, like Israel, we are a people of destiny. And to understand the story of Israel, we need to understand the call of one couple. The story begins with an unlikely man and his wife from a place called Ur. And they are childless and raising a nephew who was orphaned, and they live in a time and a place where there's lots of pagan gods that people worshipped. But their lives are forever changed when the Lord, the God who created the heavens and earth, unmistakably speaks to them. Look with me at Genesis 12, 1 through 4a. The Lord had said to Abraham, "Leave your native country, your relatives, and your father's family, and go to the land that I will show you. And I will make you into a great nation. I will bless you and make you famous, and you will be a blessing to others. And I will bless those who bless you, and curse those who treat you with contempt. And all the families on the earth will be blessed through you." So Abram departed as the Lord had instructed. So let's unpack this incredible call. First, God says He says that Abram is to leave behind 3 things: his country, his relative, and his father's family. And that means that Abram is told to launch out and start a whole new household, and he and his wife Sarai have no children. And where are they to go? They're going to a place that God will show them later. And as in later in the New Testament, the account of the book of Hebrews, we're told again that Abram is clueless about the destination. Abram has to leave behind the 3 things he knows for 6 things that only God can give. And God promised to make him a great nation that will bless others. And God says to leave behind what you know because of what I know about you. And when it comes to Abram and Sarah, God has a destiny for them. And it's a plan for a childless man to be known as Father Abraham. And thousands of years later, a few chapters later, God sends Abram outside to go to count the stars because he will have more descendants than the stars he can see. And these promises would become reality through a supernatural birth of a son. And again, this must have been hard for this childless man to grasp. And the most powerful part of the scene may be in Genesis 14:4a, where so Abram departed as the Lord had instructed. Abram went for it. He was available for God to use, and he set aside whatever confusion he faced and the debate in his mind and the doubts. He set aside his comfort and all he had known, and maybe even his pride, as the Lord had instructed him. And I like Abram's story because it reminds me a bit of my own. Over the last 6 years, I've realized this call was not about my career, but more about my character as a follower of Jesus. Over and over again, God calls and tells me to leave behind things that I cling to in order to receive more than I could ever have dreamed. And God has his eye on you today too. You also are called to belong to Jesus Christ. And this is a room filled with destiny this morning. Now, it may not be to become a pastor, although it might be. This call may be about your character. It may be about leaving behind what you cling to in order to receive only what God can give you. And there's a children's song that I believe is true for you, and it says, "You are a promise, you are a possibility, you are a great big bundle of potentiality." That's you. Before God formed you, God knew you. God wanted a relationship with you. God wants to set you apart for a unique call to love others and bless others in this world. So, what are you holding on to that God is asking you to let go of? Is it fear? Is it comfort? Is it plans? God's destiny for your life waits for you to simply follow where he leads. And as we continue with the story of Abram, that will lead to Israel. We see their story is kind of like ours. The story is like ours that, number 2, we are a people of disobedience. Abram and Sarai take off for an unknown destination, and God leads them into the promised land. And they're the first to set foot in this land where Jesus would eventually walk. But a famine soon sends them to Egypt, and this is where Abram gets afraid and begins to cut corners in following God and by lying about his wife, because you see, Sarah, he lied about Sarah's identity. She was quite beautiful, and Abram was afraid that those in power might kill him in order to take her. So he says that she's his sister. And of course, Pharaoh takes her as his wife, and then the truth comes out, and they're kicked out of Egypt. And during their stay, both Abram and his nephew Lot had acquired a lot of wealth. And their newfound fortune would eventually drive them apart. And as trouble draws on the family, things get worse between Sarah and Abram. They get impatient waiting for God's promise to come true to have a child. And that's when Sarai has an idea. She'd left Egypt with a female servant, and she had this idea that's recorded in Genesis 16, 1 through 2. It says, "Now Sarai, Abram's wife, had not been able to bear children for him, but she had an Egyptian servant named Hagar. So Sarah said to Abram, 'The Lord has prevented me from having children. Go and sleep with my servant. Perhaps I can have children through her.' And Abram agreed and with Sarah's proposal." I mean, what a scene we have here. Sarah gives Abram a hall pass and says, "You need to sleep with Hagar, her servant." Now, can you imagine this conversation? Did Abram say, "Well, honey, if you insist"? So together they go ahead and think they can fill God's promise their own way and on their own timetable. And this is not as crazy as it may first appear. I mean, in the ancient time and culture, this was a common solution for the problem of barrenness. But this is clearly not God's plan for Sarah and Abraham. They are called to trust God, not the culture around them and their own wisdom and plans. So Hagar does indeed conceive a child who is named Ishmael. And Hagar and Sarai begin to fight with one another because Hagar thinks that she's better than Sarai, and they have words. And the two women of the house fight, and Sarai turns to Abram and basically says, "This is all your fault." And they begin to argue in the family, and finally Abraham tells Sarai, just deal with it. The relationship with Sarah and Hagar becomes a scene from the Real Housewives of Canaan. And Sarah says to Hagar, she's not going to be disrespected, not in my house. And she treats her so bad that Hagar eventually runs away to the wilderness, though God has mercy on them all. This hostility will still be present over a decade later. Ishmael, the child, would struggle to get along with relatives during his life, and often raising a fist in anger. And evidently growing up in a home with tons of conflict and anger and jealousy is not good. And while destiny drove the family to start an adventure with God, brokenness now threatens to undo them. And again, I can relate. I shared with you earlier about my brokenness and my anger and my codependency, and looking back over my life, it's one area of disobedience that's threatened to undo me. I was hiding so much brokenness and insecurity while trying to make others happy that I was about to ruin my life and my family. And occasionally I would wonder why someone didn't get wise and tell me about this well-hidden secret. Within 5 years, it started unraveling. I mean, I lost a job, a marriage, and my anger simmered, and I was a workaholism and increased, and I disobeyed God, making myself an idol, trying to take the role of Savior and Lord in my own life, as well as maybe some others' lives. And suffice it to say, that was a dark time. That's some of my story. What's yours? How have you disobeyed God's call on your life? Anybody else here have poor boundaries? Do you struggle with anger or your disobedience to a hidden addiction, affliction, or that's about to become just who you are? Is it a grudge? Is it your pride? Is it a well-masked selfishness? Money mismanagement? Are you disobeying God's call to keep your eyes from wandering and your feet from walking where they should not go? Are you wasting time on social media, trapped in a never-ending game of comparison and competition? I mean, the possibilities of disobedience are almost endless. But here's the good news. Even after this soap opera-like life of Abram and Sarai, God didn't give up on them. They were the least likely couple to bless multitudes when God first called them. And they basically made those odds even a lot worse. But when sin abounds, God's grace superabounds. God comes to Abram again, and Abram answers, and God calls him to a blameless life again and establishes a covenant with him and gives him a new name, Abraham. And Sarai becomes Sarah. See, the Lord even cares about Hagar and Ishmael. And this becomes their story, and it's like our story. For like them and Israel, number 3, we are a people of deliverance. And I'm not talking about banjo music playing. They were delivered. Finally, after lots of adventures that you can read about in Genesis, and I hope you guys go back and read this stuff. I hope you're doing your daily Bible plan. But God delivers on a promise to Abraham and Sarah, and he delivers, and I mean there's a baby. Look with me what happens to this dysfunctional, disobedient couple from Genesis 21, verses 1 through 3. The Lord kept his word and did for Sarah exactly what he had promised. She became pregnant, and she gave birth to a son for Abraham in his old age. And that happened just at the time God had said it would. And Abraham named their son Isaac. Now look at the precision of God's action in this. God kept his word, doing exactly what he promised, and it all happened just like God said it would. And the name of their son Isaac, which means, and I love this, Isaac means laughter. An artist, Michael Card, says that they called him laughter, for he came after an impossible promise came true. The childless couple has a baby at last, and the childless father of many nations finally has a baby, and God specializes in supernatural deliverance. So to make a long story short, Isaac will grow up and marry Rebekah. They have 2 boys, Esau and Jacob. And Jacob has an encounter with God where he's renamed Israel. And he ends up having 12 boys who grow up each to lead one of the 12 tribes of Israel. And from one of those tribes, the tribe of Judah, from an unlikely, unexpected couple, a child is born. Another supernatural birth. And his name is, wait for it, Jesus. God delivers on the promise in the story with Abraham and Sarah. And he will do so throughout the Old Testament until, at just the right time, God will send the deliverer, Jesus, to rescue and restore every person who welcomes him into his life. And that's the story of the message to my mom, our family, that I shared earlier. Our story is a story of deliverance. God does this over and over, no matter who you are or what you've done. God can bring this gift to you. I heard about a story told by author Danielle Strickland, who she's amazing if you get to read her stuff or ever see her speak. But she gave her life to Jesus and she helps in deprived neighborhoods. And she tells the story of a woman who was a heroin addict and lived on the streets. And Danielle was ministering to her, and her street name was Flower. And she was absolutely lost in addiction and brokenness. And Danielle prayed for Flower. For over a year, she shared the hope of Jesus with her. Finally, an opportunity came, and as soon as she had a chance to talk with her, Danielle admitted doubt when it came flooding into her brain. I mean, she said, what are we doing trying to talk to this woman who is so out of it. Do you really think we can help this woman change? And then she heard another voice in her head, that one she attributes to God. And it said, flowers were meant to bloom. Flowers were meant to bloom. And even her self-chosen street name is infused with hope. So Danielle talks with Flower and invites her to her home, where Flowers slept for 3 days. And when Flower woke up, her first words to Daniel was, I need God. I was meant to bloom. Her life was delivered that day by Jesus. Flower, you, me, Abraham, Sarah, we're all people of destiny, disobedience, and deliverance. And that's our story. Now, in the summer, we have only covered one of the stories in the 38 more books of the Old Testament about Israel. But here's why. Israel's story is kind of like, well, the directions on a shampoo bottle. See, every morning I get up and I shampoo what's remaining of my hair. And I see those instructions on the back of the bottle that says, wash, rinse, repeat. And in every story of the Old Testament, one of the three things that are taking place is God is helping people to discover their destiny, or people are disobeying God's call, or God is delivering them yet again. And that's the pattern. It's predictable. Wash, rinse, repeat. And that's Israel's story over and over and over and over again until Jesus comes. And the message expands to people outside of the Israelites. And now the story is expanded from one family and one nation to all people and every nation. Now you're invited into the story. And I know you may be thinking there's no way I can be included into God's story. Well, maybe you have a reoccurring voice in your head. That voice that says, I'm not good enough. Or maybe if they only knew my failures, or I'm disqualified. And we can all fall victim to this line of thinking. We compare what we do know about ourselves to what we don't know about others. And this is why I love reading the Bible. The Bible doesn't hide the messed up people like Abraham and Sarah. And yet, God chooses to use them. God knows everything about them and about us. And He still calls us. He still loves us. And He still has a purpose. In fact, God seems to specialize in taking messed up people with a bent toward disobedience and using them to follow Him. Consider these words from 1 Corinthians 1:26 through 29. Remember, dear brothers and sisters, that few of you were wise in the world's eyes, or powerful or wealthy when God called you. Instead, God chose things that the world considers foolish in order to shame those who think they are wise. And He chose things that are powerless to shame those who are powerful. God chose things despised by the world, things counted as nothing at all, and used them to bring to nothing what the world considers important. As a result, no one can ever boast in the presence of God. So this is your invitation today. Why did God choose to use my mom and our family? It wasn't because of our resume. In fact, anyone who ever met me in high school would say I was what the world considers foolish. And we aren't called because we have it all together. We were and are just fools. And who are foolish enough to just be available. So will you make yourself available to God today? You are invited to make this story your story. We're going to do one more song together, and as the song is played, our altar is open, and I invite you, if you've never lived into this grace that God gives, if you've never told Jesus, hey, I'm here, use me, I surrender to you. You take my life, you run it. I ain't doing too good on my own. This is your time. I would be happy to pray with you. Just raise your hand. And for all of you that think, well, God really doesn't have a plan or a purpose for me, He can't use me, I bet you if you come down here and talk to Him, He will change your mind on that. But let's stand and worship together and come as you feel the Spirit lead.